This is Tall Tale TV, your podcast for sci-fi and fantasy short stories. Of Tyrants and Teakettles by Lesley Herron. Chapter 14, Bandits. Bolts of electricity snapped out from beneath the rubble and then dissipated, creating a constant crackle in the air. Vel stared at the broken machine, where the monster lay defeated and the portal had hung just moments before. He turned on his heel to face the copper robot.
What in the hell was that? You opened a portal to some kind of nightmare realm.
Berg returned the cyborg's gaze with a blank stare. He seemed to be running numbers in his head, quickly rechecking Atticus's math.
It does not appear to be a mathematical error, sir. Perhaps the schematics you provided were flawed?
Vel's AI had double-checked the transcriptions as he went. It was possible, but unlikely. Then again, the computer had become increasingly cheeky. If this was a joke, it was in poor taste, he thought. Atticus gave a piteous cry from beneath a pile of dented tea kettles and broken ceramic pots. Berg zipped off in the direction of the sound, leaving Vel alone with the girl and the machine. Piper peered around the cyborg, wrinkling her nose at the goo that was pooling beneath the severed torso of the dead beast.
Should we try again?
Vel scratched behind one of his ears, his gaze fixed on the smoldering remains of half a plant monster that were splayed out across the base of the machine.
I don't know. After seeing that...
He gestured to the creature with a thrust of his open hand.
I'm more than a little afraid to step through any gate he opens up.
Atticus approached them with a limping gait. He was rubbing at the small of his back with a tight look of pain on his face.
You don't happen to have schematics for a time machine, do you?
Vel turned to face the kid.
Even if I did, at this point, I wouldn't trust it to be accurate.
He prodded gingerly at his dislocated shoulder with a sigh.
Wait, why do you want a time machine?
So I can save my tea kettle collection.
Atticus picked up a crumpled kettle made of burnished tin and gave it a mournful, longing gaze. Vel used the strength of his mechanical arm to pop the opposite shoulder back into place. He let out a thin hiss of breath before turning back to the kid.
We have bigger problems right now. What went wrong?
Berg reached out and fished a small shard of porcelain from his master's hair.
Perhaps reconstructing circuitry from an unknown technology with contemporary materials led to unforeseen complications.
Atticus rested his head on what remained of his machine.
I thought I understood your notes and the inner workings of your technology.
He paused and plucked up the charred remnant of the original portal device from beneath a pile of papers and debris. He turned the melted chunk of metal over in his hands, looking for any clues he may have missed. Piper put a consoling hand on her brother's shoulder.
I'm sure you did everything right. We can just rebuild it and try again.
I'm sorry, but no,
Vel interjected, putting his hand up to halt the conversation.
We can't take the chance that something could go wrong again. The next portal could open up inside a volcano or the abyss of the ocean.
He stressed the severity of the situation, trying to impress that drowning in salt water was not a great option. He lowered his hand and offered a frown to the broken machine. It was still sputtering weakly, spitting out small sparks of electricity.
No, we have to think this through.
Well, I suppose we could take it to my teacher.
Atticus looked up and around, gazing among them expectantly. Piper felt that all-too-familiar shudder of repulsion ripple down her spine.
We don't need the help of that college or its professors.
Atticus gave his sister a warm smile.
It's okay. My teacher is really smart. He helps me whenever I get stuck with a problem. And he knows a thing or two about interdimensional travel.
He seemed to brighten at the idea and moved over to stand close to his machine.
I'll just have to rig up some sort of device to hold us up to the college.
Berg was at his master's side once more.
Might I suggest removing the plant creature from atop it first, sir? Good idea.
The two of them began to push and heave against the dead creature. Vel's hands fell to his hips.
Your professor at the university knows about gates and portal traveling?
He couldn't bring down the arch of his brow. Berg zipped around the creature and began tugging at one of the thicker tentacles from the other side. Atticus stopped pushing for a moment to wipe his forehead with the back of his hand.
Oh, sure. More than anyone else at the college. He used to specialize in it. He says he was never successful, but he tells all the newbies that if we figure anything out, to bring it to him.
He resumed shoving uselessly against the limp, lifeless body.
And that doesn't strike you as weird?
Piper cut in, dancing over broken I-beams and dead plant limbs. She pulled against her brother's shirt, lowering her voice.
I don't like this.
Atticus paused long enough to scratch at the top of his head.
Yeah, I don't like it much either. It's too big to move.
He threw himself against the bulk of the dead beast.
But it sure was exciting.
Piper turned with a petulant sigh to give the cyborg a pleading look. Vel's conscience pulled him in two. On one hand, he understood her plight. He knew what she was asking of him with that look. But, on the other hand, he was so close to being reunited with his family. Despite his misgivings, a grain of trepidation began to invade his mind. They couldn't very well traipse around town, announcing to all that they had made a machine that would allow anyone to traverse the realms. Not to mention what a power-hungry military might do with it. Vel rubbed at that familiar twinge of pain in his temple. He remained this way for several long, tense moments before a plan blinked to life.
All right, how about this?
Vel returned his gaze to the girl.
We'll skip dragging the machine around and grab some of the papers. We pop in to see his teacher and explain that everything on these sheets is just theoretical. Have him check over the work. If he can make sense of what we show him, then we decide if we want to bring him into the fold. That way, your brother doesn't draw any undue attention to himself. I find out if this quack is the real deal, and we're out of there in a heartbeat.
Piper bit at her lip before closing the gap between herself and the cyborg. She lowered her voice and looked up at him.
You and I aren't actually papered, and you want us to just march into the university, a top-secret facility, and speak with someone who designs death machines for a living? Are you daft?
Vel put a hand up, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips.
That's where Al comes in. Your brother isn't even allowed on the premises without his chaperone. If we're accompanied by Alphonse, we should be able to skirt past any of the guards with his say-so.
Atticus was still heaving against the plant beast with all his might, and had missed everything that was said outside of his own grunts and groans. Piper wavered, her gaze shifting from her brother to the cyborg and back. This was going against her very beliefs. She knew she wouldn't be okay setting foot inside the college and mingling with those who had thrown her out and left her to die. But if this was what it took to help get her friend home and her brother severed from their ties, she could play along. She crossed her arms in front of her chest. Fine. Vel's smile widened. He knew this was hard for her, and hoped she understood how much that sacrifice meant to him. He moved towards Atticus and threw an arm around his shoulder.
Forget the machine. It's not that portable anyway. Just go grab a few of those schematics, and we'll fix this when we get back, all right?
He pulled against the kid, steering him over to where the desk had been.
Oh, that's a great idea!
Atticus dropped to his hands and knees and began foraging through the mess of papers. He scanned each one, looking for the proper information. The long tendril that Berg was tugging on gave way, and he toppled backwards, end over end, the limb spraying foul sap like a fountain. He pushed himself back upright, large globs of purple goo dripping from his torso.
Sir, I think I've damaged my elbow joint.
Atticus raised an eyebrow.
Berg, you don't have elbows.
Berg lifted up his arm, a noticeable kink halfway up his segmented limb.
True, but it appears as though I may have acquired one, sir.
Convincing Al to take them to the university had been the crux of their plan.
"He's not scheduled to make an appearance for at least another 6 weeks,"
he had said, shifting uneasily on the balls of his feet, as if speaking of it might incur some terrible wrath. Persuading the guard into accompanying them to the university had forced Vel to use all of his wit and charm, or as most people would describe it, threats and intimidation. After doing their best to make themselves presentable, the group traveled the long abandoned roads that led from Atticus's decommissioned hangar all the way up to the heart of the town, until emerging once more into the main hustle and bustle of the busy thoroughfare. On this trip, however, they continued past the no-guard zone into what seemed to be more of an upper-class part of the market. Rickety steam cars trundled along happily as people went about their daily routines of their unassuming lives. Clunky robots were sweeping the streets, customers were leaving and entering shops at a dizzying speed, and a horde of shoeshiners were setting up their stations every 100 feet. There were all walks of life pushing by them, but they all appeared to have one thing in common: wealth. These citizens were dressed in fine clothes, adorned with rich trinkets, or speaking in a manner that betrayed their upbringing. Even the buildings were clean and well kept. Feeling a dash of insecurity, Vel buckled his coat over the large Icarus stain on his shirt. More than once they had to drag Atticus away from the street performers, or tug him off the shoe-shining stations. The sooner they finished this little side adventure, the sooner they would all get what they wanted, and they needed to do so without causing a stir. Piper was uncharacteristically silent as they walked, her feelings wavering as she followed slowly behind. She was apprehensive. There was a good chance that she and her cyborg friend would be tossed from the city walls, or worse. The High Inquisitor wasn't known for his forgiving nature, and they were just going to waltz into his college like they were sightseeing. She reached out and tugged against Vel's coat. When he paused, she leaned in to whisper to him,
"I don't like this. I had this gut feeling something bad's gonna happen."
Vel stepped to the side of the walkway, allowing the others to pass ahead of him. He looked down at Piper and cocked an eyebrow.
"I know you're not happy about this, but—"
"Not happy doesn't even begin to cover it. It's like we're marching straight into the lion's den with stakes hanging from our necks, and nobody seems to care. The university is a heartless cesspit of unwashed, power-hungry mongrels."
Vel's eyebrows knit together.
"Not a fan of progress?"
Piper spat on the ground and then returned his gaze with one of pure loathing.
"It's not that. The High Inquisitor gave the order to toss the lesser people into the wastes. He essentially signed death warrants for them, myself included."
He could see the tears welling up in her large amber eyes. Her unease and anger were entirely understandable. Vel placed a hand lightly on her shoulder.
"I get it. You're scared."
He squeezed her shoulder when he saw her open her mouth to protest.
"It's okay. I am too. Look at all the guards. The closer we get to the college, the more their numbers increase. But we need this trip. After we get this information, we can find a way to free your brother from the college."
He paused when his mind drifted back to the rather large medical bill weighing heavily in one of his pockets.
"And possibly the guild."
Piper's shoulders relaxed, and she let out a reluctant sigh. Some of her fears were eased, but only on the surface. She knew he was just telling her what she wanted to hear, but it was enough to give her some respite from her anxiety. She rolled her eyes a little as Vel gave her a smile. Vel pulled his hand away and folded his arms across his chest.
"And if we can't, then I'll just take you guys with me, and that'll settle that debt. Come on, let's go catch up with the others, before Atticus offends any street performers."
The rest of the group hadn't gotten far, only a few minutes ahead of them, but the amount of people that Vel and Piper had to push past grew increasingly overwhelming, and they lost sight of the others altogether. The closer to the college they got, the more the size of the crowd escalated. They didn't appear to be shoppers or vendors, Many of them seemed to have come up from the slums. They were shouting incoherently, chanting in the way only a mob can. Vel locked an arm around Piper, holding her close, lest they be torn in opposite directions. He leaned down close to her ear, but even at that distance had to shout for her to hear him.
"Is this normal?"
Piper shouted something back, but it was drowned out by the hammering sound of hundreds of angry people. The crowd was growing even thicker and had coalesced into what could only be described as a less than peaceful protest. All that was missing was the pitchforks and torches. The crowd continued to push against them, sweeping them into their midst as the massive bodies surged toward the college. Vel tried his best to shield the girl from the worst of it, but they were being pressed in from all sides. It was all he could do to keep them upright, and stumbling would mean death by trampling. And then the crowd stopped its forward momentum, still screaming with fury, but no longer marching onward. They had reached their destination. Vel and Piper were less than 200 feet from the gleaming marble steps of what he assumed had to be the university. Its large crimson exterior and black double front doors created a rather imposing appearance, with its 3 floors all converging on the front of the building. This created an outcropping, a veranda of sorts. It was a massive, half-circular platform that sat wedged between the 2nd and 3rd floors. Guards lined the edge every 5 feet or so, rifles at the ready, and a group of figures in sharp black suits were huddled in heated discussion near the back of the platform. Vel barely had a chance to marvel at the architectural triumph of the massive structure when he noticed a bystander in the mob, furiously waving at him. Atticus had climbed a light post, nearly halfway up, and was shouting for his sister to get their attention. At the base of the pole was Alphonse and Berg, the mob parting smartly around both of them, unsure what to make of the odd trio. Vel forced his way through the crowd, hauling Piper along behind him. As they broke through into the tiny clearing, he took a deep breath of air. He wasn't usually claustrophobic, but having been literally crushed to death in the past, he now had a thing about being pressed on from all sides. There was a gun blast from the veranda, and everyone's attention swiveled around at once, the shouts going considerably quieter, but not gone. A guard closest to the ledge lowered his gun and stepped back, resuming his previous post. Vel saw 2 people, dressed in sharp black suits, step up to the edge of the ornate balustrade in his place. He squinted up at them and could see that they both had long, platinum blonde hair, and their faces were hidden behind flawless porcelain masks, one molded into tragedy and the other in comedy. One of them reached out a hand in a solemn gesture for silence. The other tapped forcefully at the copper microphone placed neatly before them. She cleared her throat a few times and began to address the crowd in a stiff manner. "Citizens, we urge you for your silence and patience. We at the college have little understanding for this impromptu gathering. We would like to know the cause of this rally and the source of your anger so that we may help you as best we can." The 2 voices melded together, but Vel could tell that both of the people in the sharp black suits were speaking in unison, a sign of a very well-prepared speech, meaning they, of course, understood what was going on. The incoherent screech of hundreds of voices redoubled to greater heights than it had been before. Some were shouting for justice, screaming about those who had been removed from the town and their fears of who would be next. Others were crying for food, worried about the limited supply and what the iron border meant for them. A myriad of other concerns and laments were released into the cacophony of complaints. Vel looked around at those pushing closer to the marble steps of the university. There were a few people dressed in rags blending in with the crowd, but it was those dressed in the finest of garments who were the loudest. "What about those riots? I'm afraid to step outside my door."
"When will the borders reopen and the iron wall removed?"
"Why are people being thrown out into the wastes? Can't you do something about the food shortage?"
Where is the High Inquisitor during all of this suffering?
Tragedy and Comedy put their hands up once more to silence the crowd.
We can assure you that the college is coordinating with the military and as well with your High Inquisitor to do what they can to lessen the strain of these inconveniences to your daily lives. We hope that...
The rest of their speech was drowned out by the sudden outcry from the crowd. There were boos and jeers intermingling with mutterings of general dislike. Vel was growing uneasy and was about to suggest they try and force their way out of the crowd to safer grounds when a different voice broke over the microphone. He looked up to see a man dressed in hooded robes of white with an owl mask step forward. It was the very same man from the newspaper clipping. The High Inquisitor raised a hand, urging for silence. This gesture was unnecessary, as the crowd had immediately fallen still at his arrival.
My fellow citizens, I hear your pleas, and they have not fallen upon deaf ears.
His accent was obviously foreign, his voice deep and commanding, yet reassuring at the same time.
Your concerns for your own safety and for those of your neighbors are commendable and understandable. However, they are misplaced.
The mob erupted again in protest. The High Inquisitor simply stood there, allowing it to wash over him as he patiently waited for silence. The effect of his stoicism was unnerving, and the crowd quieted like a scolded child to let him continue.
The people that were removed from the city were done so not in an act of condemnation, but one of salvation. In these hard times where food is scarce, who do you think will feel its effects the hardest? The shopkeepers? The middle class? Or those who cannot afford even a roof over their heads? To leave the poorest among us in the streets would be a death sentence in and of itself.
The man actually struck the banister before him with a clenched fist. He allowed the crowd a moment to swallow his words before continuing.
I was unwilling to stand by and watch as my people, my countrymen, starved in the streets. We had no food to give, but to do nothing would have been as bad as slitting their throats myself. Instead, I set up a task force to find those most at risk and transport them outside the walls of our city. They are transported to farmlands beyond the dead zone, where they may help tend the earth, provide for themselves, and ultimately for the rest of the city.
Piper hissed angrily, folding her arms over her chest.
That's a blatant lie!
She didn't bother keeping her voice low. The hush among the crowd allowed her words to travel, and for a brief moment, Vel was certain the Inquisitor had turned his head in their direction, even flicking upwards to see the scrawny boy clinging to the light post. But the High Inquisitor continued on as if he hadn't heard the disruption.
The rest of your council are tirelessly working to help solve the other crises that this city faces. We will remove the wall when we are certain that you will be safe. And we are in negotiations with other countries to help ease the plight of the food shortage. And I can assure you...
The Inquisitor paused, leaning against the balustrade of the veranda, his voice curling into a cruel sneer.
There are no riots. This is just a rumor put forth by a rogue guard, and once found, they will be dealt with accordingly.
He stepped back, raising his hands again.
As a show of good faith, my colleagues and I, and those that attend the college itself, have agreed to ration our food intake to match what you, the people, are having to endure. And will continue to do so until equality has been restored to our great city.
The reaction from the other figures on the veranda told Vel this agreement was news to them, and it was something they were very unhappy about. But it had the desired effect. The demeanor of the angry mob shifted, and soon the murmurs and mutterings of distrust melted away into tones of agreement. Vel had to admit, the man made a compelling argument. He was either a true humanitarian or one hell of a politician. The crowd began to disperse awkwardly, as though they felt foolish for having not thought of this rationale themselves. He continued to watch the High Inquisitor with a new level of interest. Seeing that the crowd had been mollified, the Inquisitor signaled for a guard to approach him. The owl face barely moved, but the man gestured in Vel's direction with a flick of his wrist. Vel's blood went cold. Why would the Inquisitor single them out, unless he had heard Piper's comment, or recognized him as the cause of the riots? Then he noticed Atticus, still clutching the lamppost, furiously waving at the Inquisitor.
"What are you doing?"
Piper spat, tugging on the leg of her brother's pants in an attempt to remove him from his perch. Atticus climbed down from the lamppost, dusting his hands on his shirt. He turned his attention back to his sister.
"What? I was just saying hi. To the High Inquisitor?"
Atticus shrugged.
"Yeah, I mean, why not? We came all the way down here to see him."
Piper's voice cracked.
"Your teacher is the High Inquisitor?"
She barely had a moment to process this information. Twice in one day, she had the startling revelation that her brother had been fed to not one, but two wolves. This one even more dangerous than the last. And in his innocent state, Atticus couldn't tell the teeth from the claws.
"You four are to accompany me into the college. The High Inquisitor wishes to speak with you personally."
The guard that approached them had a well-fed appearance and was looking rather annoyed at having to retrieve the rabble from the doorstep. He gave an audible, irksome sigh and trudged his way back towards the college. Al was jogging lightly to catch up and began speaking in a rushed undertone to this guard, as if they knew one another. Vel turned to Piper.
"Look, before you say anything..."
He paused, putting a hand up to keep her from interrupting.
"Let's find out what he wants. Then we'll get what we want and get out of here, okay? Just try to curb your enthusiastic nature and keep your thoughts to yourself."
Piper's frown was pulling hard at the corners of her face. She couldn't be more angry at this moment if she tried.
"Sure, let's just mosey on in and have a good old chat with the devil, shall we?"
Vel leveled a finger at her, but didn't say anything as he turned on his heel and followed the shiny glint of the copper backside of Berg. Piper grumbled angrily to herself and stepped in line. She should have sold this man as soon as she found him in Silverport. The imposing nature of the crimson exterior of the college melted into one of general hospitality as they stepped into the foyer. The hardwood floors creaked gently as they walked past empty work tables and benches. There was a single large desk at the end of a long runner. A young woman behind the desk stood to ask what they were doing in this establishment, their two guards having remained near the doors, but was intercepted by the High Inquisitor, who stepped onto the runner and reached out a hand to greet Atticus.
"What a surprise! I did not expect to see you so soon."
"Oh, yeah, sorry. I know I'm not supposed to just show up."
Atticus chuckled nervously, pulling his hat off his head and wringing it in his hands.
"But my friends and I were working on a new project, and I'm totally stumped. We were hoping you might be able to help."
The High Inquisitor removed his mask and smiled down affectionately at Atticus.
"For you, dear boy, I have all the time in the world."
Vel was rooted in place. The nerves in his body were tingling, filling him with that sudden adrenaline rush of the fight-or-flight response. The High Inquisitor was now standing before them, deep in conversation with the kid, his long black hair tied in a tail at the nape of his neck, and that shock of white in his bangs hanging down over his glasses, the way it always had. Their eyes met, the High Inquisitor noticing Vel for the first time. His face fell as a glint of recognition lit up those bright blue eyes, and a smile began to curve at the corners of his mouth. He took a step forward, that small, hesitant smile turning into a broad grin. He closed the distance between the two of them and embraced the cyborg in a tight hug.
"Brother, it's so good to see you again."
Of Tyrants and Teakettles is Book 2 of the ongoing Sci-Fantasy series by author Lesley Herron, Join us as the adventure unfolds, with new chapters releasing every few weeks.
Wait, was that... Did they got you watching after that Atticus kid now?
That's right. I've been looking after him for near 4 months now.
I thought old Iron Brute Johnson had that job.
He did. Had to retire.
Say what? He was only 42.
Yeah, well, couldn't take the stress no more, could he? Looked like an old man when he handed over the keys to me. Eyes kept twitching, jumping at noises. Poor bastard.
So is it true what they say then? That the kid's some kind of mad scientist, hell-bent on world domination?
Nah, he's a good lad. Just a bit, well, disconnected with reality. If you can get used to the explosions, the killer robots, and extra-dimensional beings, it's not a bad job, really.
Yeah, sounds right peachy.